Hi students, I hope you're doing well. I apologize for not being able to be there in class, but I hope to return after spring break. To help you with better understanding the content of Chapter 2, I'm going to use this program called Screencast-O-Matic. You can hear my voice and I can talk you through the PowerPoint. It's not the same as me being there, but hopefully it will help you better understand the concepts and content in Chapter 2. So if we take a look at that next slide, I think we went over this when I was there, that Chapter 2 will contain vocabulary and language development. At the beginning of the chapter, we will deal with the content, which is going to be mainly what do we do for students prior to getting into exceptional learners, and how do students get into an exceptional learners program. Also, we'll have some mini assessments and self-assessments along the way, and we have a case study from the case study book, Who Will Help Patrick. Eligibility team, I think we've spoken about this. We know that Juanita Pope really did not have an eligibility team. This is a group of individuals who really kind of advocate for the student. They meet, they work with the student and the parents to help plan or help provide for the learning needs of a student. This does not just occur for people who have an IEP, but this starts with a student who may be at risk. The team can be made up of certainly the classroom teacher. There might be an exceptional learner specialist that's involved, usually a guidance counselor, sometimes an administrator. It's a group of 3 or 4 people who really kind of begin to work with the student to prevent the student from having to go into exceptional learners, or to work with the student to make sure that if they do go into an exceptional learning program, that there really is a need. Enduring understanding, we talked about this. It's the big idea that captures the essence of a theme. And if we were to look at the big idea in this chapter, it would have to do with the identification of students with learning disabilities and how they get into the program. We're going to be looking at misconceptions, definitions, history, and legislation in this chapter, and we're going to be looking I'm sorry, in Chapter 1 we were looking at misconceptions, definitions, history, and legislation to become oriented to special education. So the big idea for Chapter 1 was orientation to special ed. In Chapter 2 we're going to be looking at structures for meeting the needs of, although I have exceptional learners there, I really mean structures for meeting the needs of at-risk and exceptional learners. English language learners, most of you are probably familiar with this. This refers to students whose first language is other than English and whose command of English is limited. And this is also, depending on what state you're from, this is also translated into a program called ESOL, or English for Speakers of Other Languages. And this is these programs are state funded and required by law. There's a video there. And when you have time, I would urge you, it's a short video, to look at that. Again, we want to make sure that if a student is having difficulty, it's not because of their language. So we have programs in place that can help us meet the needs of those particular students. Now, evidence or research-based interventions. When I get back, we're going to talk a little bit about these interventions. These are strategies that teachers can use to help better meet the needs of students. But these strategies are based on research. They're not just things that teachers pull out of the air. Robert Marzano is someone who is at the forefront of sharing with teachers evidence-based interventions. We'll talk more about that later in the chapter. Fidelity. Fidelity refers to the manner in which we deliver a particular strategy or a program. So if you are a student with special needs and you're in a small group instruction and we're using a specific commercial program to help meet your needs. It might be a computerized program. It might be a program that's guided by the teacher. Fidelity means that the teacher is using it how it was intended to be used. All right? So if a particular program is supposed to be used with, let's say, Juanita Pope in a certain way, and you're a teacher and you deviate from how that program is supposed to be used, then the effectiveness of that program is going to be impacted. So fidelity means delivery in a manner in which it was designed or prescribed. And this also has to do with research-based interventions. If you're using a research-based intervention or strategy, you want to use it in the way that it was intended. Flexible grouping, it's a type of differentiation in which students are organized into groups. As future teachers, what you want to be able to do is to be able to use groups that are not static, especially when you're working with students with special needs. You'll be looking at lots of data, and you'll be moving students throughout the year in and out certain groups depending on their needs. So what that means is that if you are having difficulty in reading, we're not isolating you in one group and keeping you there all year. We're measuring and assessing your skill level, moving you into groups that are most appropriate to meet your needs. Fluency, we'll talk about this, I believe it's in your chapter. Fluency is the ability to accurately and quickly comprehend or express. Oftentimes when we take a look at fluency, it has to do with the flow or your ability to read fluently. There's also something called math fluency, and that's the ability to solve basic calculations. So fluency is that flow. When I used to teach third grade, I used to talk about the idea that when we read, we want our reading to sound like we're talking. So that's fluency. Also, there are a lot of checks, a lot of assessments that are used along the way to assess students' fluency. Research says that there's a 0.80 correlation, which is a very high correlation, between a student's ability to be fluent and their ability to comprehend text. So if you're a fluent reader, there's a strong likelihood that you'll also be able to comprehend. So fluency is one of those vital signs that is assessed early on with even kindergarten students in terms of letter recognition fluency to determine whether or not they are moving forward and being able to express themselves in an appropriate manner. Formative assessment, we talked about this in Chapter 1. I think you know the difference between formative and summative assessment, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but you can read it. And you can take a look at the next slide, which has to do with summative assessments. Remember, formative is assessment for learning. In other words, we're assessing students periodically along the way. I sometimes call that term dipsticking, you know, when you check the oil in your car. So we use formative assessment to kind of dipstick and see where our students are, and we use that information to inform our instruction. Summative assessment is at the end, the sum, to see how the student has done overall when we look back. Okay, so that takes care of our vocabulary. I hope that helps you a little bit. Now, if we take a look at what we're going to be talking about in this chapter, here are some questions. What guides the identification of students for special ed services? In other words, how does a student get from point A to point B, from being at risk to receiving special ed services? What's the role of the IEP for students in special ed? And what are the placement options and issues? So when we talk about placement, we mean what type of program best meets the needs of a student. Is it self-contained, where the student is pretty much in with students that have the same ability? Sometimes when we work with Down syndrome students, they are pretty much in a self-contained placement. Or we might have a student who has difficulty in reading who is in a regular classroom placement but might be pulled out for special skills or special work with a particular teacher. What's the role, teacher's role in providing special ed? How about the integration of people with disabilities into a larger society, which kind of touches on the deinstitutionalization idea we talked about in Chapter 1. And then special education in the context of standard-based reform. So where does special education relate to where we're moving as a profession? Now, we're not going to take time to do a book walk, but hopefully you've already read Chapter 2 and you've gone through it and you have a pretty good idea. Each chapter has true and false questions, and I trust that you have looked at these already. And I'm going to kind of move through and maybe talk about, I'm going to go to this slide here and just talk a little bit about the answers. So that first question, all professionals agree that technology should be used to its fullest to aid people with disabilities. Well, that, that word all is kind of a signal. Not all professionals believe that technology should be used to its fullest to aid people. Now, many people do. Technology has made some, has helped students in many wonderful ways, but there are some people, small groups of people, experts believe that somebody with special needs could become too dependent on technology and not be able to be independent enough. Number 2, all students with disabilities must now be included in standardized testing, just like students without disabilities. Well, that's false. Most students are included in the testing, and we talked a little bit about the fact that the state provides some alternative testing for small groups of students who have severe learning disabilities or learning needs, but not all. Research is inconclusive as to whether, number 3, whether special education classes are ineffective and that full inclusion is effective. So when we talk about full inclusion, we mean having the student in the classroom all the time. And the research on this is inconclusive due to flaws in methodology. In other words, the ability to test or to conduct a study to determine whether or not full inclusion is effective is flawed. It's a challenge. Most people would agree that schools offer what we would call a spectrum of services, from those that are self-contained to those in which the student is in the classroom all the time and somebody comes in the classroom just to consult. We'll go over those that spectrum in Chapter 2. Number 4, everyone agrees that teachers, again, the key word is everyone, in early intervention programs need to assess parents as well as children. Well, that's a real practical thing to do and probably an important thing to do, but not everybody agrees with that. Some people think that assessment really should just focus on the young children and not the parents. Number 5, everyone agrees that good early childhood programming for students with or without disabilities should be the same. False. There's a lot of disagreement about the type of program that should be used for young children who may or may not have disabilities. And the last one, professionals agree that all students with disabilities in secondary school should be given a curriculum focused on vocational skills. We all know people in our classroom, we all know friends that may have a disability. That does not condemn them to being in vocational programs. They can often overcome or work around their disability, so the answer to that is false. Okay, so let's take a look at what we'll be talking about here in the next few slides. What guides the identification of students for special ed services? That will be the one that we'll talk about. So we have a student who's at risk, who's having difficulty We're not interested yet in putting them in special ed, but what are some things that we can do prior to placement in special ed that may even prevent them from having to go or receive special ed services? So if you take a look at this next picture, the question that I would ask would be how do these pictures relate to evaluation? And hopefully you've looked at this and you've studied it. And we can come up with, I ask this question in the class, and usually I get responses that each student has a different kind of way of looking at these pictures. But let me give you just my take on it. If we look at the top left, when we're looking at students with special needs, we're really looking at focusing on some very specific skills, such as fluency, that students might need to have to be successful. So when I take a look at the top left-hand side, I see bar graphs or charts, line graphs, and with different colors. And oftentimes teachers nowadays will be generating those types of charts for their students based on assessment, and they'll use those charts to help them design instruction. If we look below that, we see lots of hands, right? So when we're working with students with special needs, there are a lot of people involved. If we take a look in the middle, we're going to be spending some time talking about RTI, which is response to intervention, and the 3 tiers. That's a good model to depict the components of RTI. And bottom right, we see that there's a blueprint. When we're working with students that are at risk or have special needs, we want to have a plan. We want to know where we're going. We want to have a blueprint. And then up at the top, if you look at the magnifying glass, that different than with students who do not have learning needs, we have to look very closely, very specifically at the skill level and the skill deficiencies as well as the strengths of students who are at risk or have special needs. You remember this from Chapter 1, to ensure that all students receive a free and appropriate education of FAPE, and that exceptional education students receive services in their LRE, which is their least restrictive environment. Schools must employ effective means to identify students with exceptional needs. So we talked briefly about that in Chapter 1, that a requirement by law is that students identify students who may need special ed services. So we start from the very beginning. What do those processes look like that begin to identify students who may end up in exceptional learner programs? Okay, and again, we're not labeling them at this time. We're just looking at, students who might have special needs. Now this slide will be familiar to you from Chapter 1. This is the legislation, the IDEA legislation from Chapter 1, and the requirements by school districts to, number 1, identify, to provide students, number 2, with a free and appropriate education at no cost. Number 3, to provide due process. And I mentioned this briefly in Chapter 1. If a student or if a parent disagrees with what's on the IEP, the parent has a right to have a hearing and to call in an arbitrator or a moderator to see if that can or can't be changed. You know about least restrictive environment. That's the goal if a student is in special ed. And you know that any student that receives special ed services must have an IEP. All right, let's go to the second idea, pre-referral teams. I think you've got a pretty good background here. They are a team to determine if a student's academic, now catch this, academic or behavior needs can be addressed without having to be referred to special ed through the RTI process. So when we talk about pre-referral intervention, now think about what that word means. So pre-referral, that means before we make a referral to special ed, we want to have some interventions in place that can address the academic or behavior needs of students before placing them into special ed, or before testing them to be placed in special ed. In other words, we want to do everything we can to try to address their needs before we incorporate or have them qualify for special ed. And also notice that it's not only students that have academic problems. We start talking about RTI, it's students that have behavior problems. And we can do the same kinds of, we can use the same kinds of structures for students with academic issues as we can for students with behavior issues. It's just much harder to address behavior concerns when you're a regular classroom teacher. What's in your wallet? We'll talk about that when I get back. That was going to be a group activity that we were going to do. Now, this is key. The purpose of pre-referral teams include establishing ownership of students with disabilities by general, not special educators. Okay? This means that when we have a pre-referral team, the classroom teacher really is the key. Now, the special educator, those who work in special ed situations can certainly assist the pre-referral team, but we want that ownership to come from the regular classroom teacher. We saw in Juanita Pope that we had very little ownership of students through regular teacher. The pre-referral team, again, picture a small group of people, maybe a table size, the number of students at your table, representing the classroom teacher, the guidance counselor possibly, perhaps a skill specialist or a reading specialist, maybe an administrator. They're sitting around, they're looking at data on the student, and they are generating strategies or ideas on how to better meet the needs of students. They go out and try those ideas, come back and report, see where they are. We'll talk, that's called the Plan, Do, Study, Act process. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The other idea of pre-referral team is to reduce the number of referrals to special education. All right, the referral rate was an area in which many school districts were criticized in the 80s and 90s, and efforts have been made to try to, especially for students who were poor in inner cities, the referral rate for special ed was much higher than those in other schools. We'll talk a little bit about that when I get back. And it's also, the pre-referral team is also used to help make decisions about which tier in the RTI process, response to intervention process, students should be in. So the pre-referral team has several functions. It'll be very important that you know all four of these and that you understand them. Now, these are the people that may be on the team. Certainly, a classroom teacher is involved at every stage. Maybe a learning specialist, could be a reading or math specialist. There might be an exceptional ed specialist, someone who can help guide the regular classroom to resources, provide some advice. There might be a school psychologist involved. There might be a guidance counselor and possibly an administrator. Now, if I were there, I'm not sure we'll do this when I get back, but I had a little PowerPoint that I wanted to share with Justin. And the PowerPoint really identifies Justin as an at-risk student, very similar to Juanita Pope. And I can probably share the gist of that with you when I get back. But let's say that we are Justin. His mom is hardly on the scene. Justin has to fend for himself, doesn't have anybody to watch over him in the evening. His mother is out in the park doing who knows what. So Justin is pretty much on his own, but he's very, very streetwise. And Justin is having trouble in school. His mother, and I'm just making this scenario up, his mother happens to come to school to see you, and you are Justin's teacher. She has heard about special education services and she wants the following information from you. She wants to know what this thing, IDEA, is called, Individual with Disabilities Education Act. And what does it mean for her and Justin? You know, so my question to you is, would you know how to explain IDEA and how it relates to she as a parent and to Justin? She also heard this term called pre-referral team. And why does the school have one? She knows that Justin has a pre-referral team, but she's not sure who's going to be on the team. So who would you have on your pre-referral team? And the fact that you are have a pre-referral team, does this mean that Justin will be receiving special ed services? So what I'd like you to do is I'd like to put you into that role. You know, your mom, Justin's mom has an appointment, and you know that these are the questions that she's going to ask you. Would you be able to share or provide information to her in a way that she could understand it? Okay, so now we get to one of the big topics in Chapter 2. The first topic is response to intervention. The second topic is going to be IEP. Okay. So, how do we determine special education eligibility? In other words, what are the steps that we take before a student is placed into special ed? And as a classroom teacher, this is real critical work for you, because the work prior to being placed in special education falls really on the classroom teacher. So, response to intervention, RTI, refers to students' change or lack of change in academic performance, again, or behavior as a result of instruction. All right, so the first thing we look at, if we have a student that's at risk, and I'm going to go to the second arrow in a minute, is that student receiving quality basic instruction in the classroom? That's the second arrow. And if I, as a principal, or if I am a skill specialist or a school psychologist, and you convene or ask that the pre-referral team meet, and someone says, well, let's see how you deal with Justin in the classroom, or let's see how Justin participates in the classroom. And as a school psychologist, let's say, for an example, I come into your classroom and I see that you are ineffective in being able to deliver instruction to Justin. You might be having him in whole group instead of small group. You might be using a program that's not appropriate, or you might not be using the program with fidelity. Then we're going to stop there and we're going to talk about, well, before we even think about special education, we need to make sure that Justin is getting quality instruction in the classroom. So think of that as the first step, or the first thing we look at in terms of being able to address the needs of Justin. And this is the key initial purpose for the use of RTI, is to help the teachers deliver quality instruction. And then if that instruction doesn't work, then we can take a look at special ed. But there are several things that we need to do before we get to that point. There's a video there too that I think might be helpful to you as well. So this video, next video back in the day, talks about how students used to qualify for special education. So back in the day, there was something called the discrepancy model. The student was given an IQ test and then given an achievement test. It might be reading or math. And then if there was a gap between the IQ and the achievement, and if that gap was big enough as defined by the state, then that student qualified, okay? So if, let's say that I had an IQ of 100, all right? But when I took my achievement tests, I score on a particular test, perhaps I scored low on the achievement test. I can't give you a number because that wouldn't be accurate, but I scored low. Now, a psychologist would get out a scale that he or she would use, and if that discrepancy between IQ, which is supposedly your ability, and achievement, which is where you are achieving, if that gap was big enough, you qualified. Now, this this caused a lot of problems, and if you would watch the video, the YouTube video, this gentleman explains the discrepancy model much better than I do, and tells you why it's such a problem. And the reason why I want you to take a look at this is because we're going to look at the discrepancy model as one model of qualifying somebody for special ed, and then we're going to look at RTI as another process or another framework or another model. So we're going to kind of compare and contrast the old with the new. All right, so let's just take a look, let's kind of zoom out a little bit, and let's take a look at the big picture here. How would Justin get to special ed if he needed? Well, let's start up at the top. Let's say that based on screening assessments, probably formative assessments, maybe even some summative assessments, we'd probably look at both together. We classified Justin as being at risk. In other words, he's got some academic or behavior issues. The pre-referral team meets to discuss which tier and what interventions should be used, and we'll talk about tiers in a minute. If the interventions within those tiers don't work, there's 3 tiers, each level of each tier, the interventions become more intense, but let's say that none of those interventions work, then the pre-referral team meets to determine whether or not Justin should have what we would call a CA, or a comprehensive assessment. The comprehensive assessment is then administered, usually by a school psychologist, and if Justin qualifies and if Mom approves, an IEP is developed and Justin receives special ed services. Now, that sounds pretty simple, but if we take a look at that third bubble or third ellipse, the interventions and RTI exist there, and there's several steps that need to occur before there's a suggestion that Justin receive a comprehensive assessment. All right, so this is a little kind of open activity that you can do. So take a look at that and see if you can fill in the right words. This is a description of the tiers. So when we take a look at Tier 1, we're talking about screening assessments 3 or 4 times a year. Now, we talk about Tier 1, we're talking about students that do fairly well. They have very few areas of need, and most of what we would call your regular students fall into Tier 1. About 80% of the students are in Tier 1. So when we talk about screening assessments, that means that teachers are going to do some type of assessment 3 to 4 times a year just to dipstick, just to double check, make sure the student is on track and progressing appropriately. Oftentimes these assessments are connected somehow to the state standards and to the state assessments. Now, the teacher uses research-based strategies for all students and differentiates when there's individual needs. So basically, in Tier 1, the teacher's pretty much handling the student without outside interventions. If there are interventions, the teacher is doing that within the classroom pretty much on their own. So the rationale is, when we consider whether a student is eligible for special ed, the first step is to make sure that the teacher is using effective instruction and effective curriculum in place. So I want to emphasize that again. At Tier 1, where you have 80% of the students are doing fairly well. You want to make sure that all students are receiving, number one, a quality instruction, and number two, having a curriculum that's appropriate to their needs. Now let's say that we're Justin, and let's say that at Tier 1, I'm having trouble in the classroom. Somebody comes in, it might be a school psychologist, and observes me and notes that the teacher is using effective instruction, is doing the best they can. But Justin's needs just aren't met. He needs something more than what is offered in Tier 1. That's when we would go to Tier 2. Tier 2 would be students that are provided with research-based, it's RB interventions in small group settings, and our progress monitored on a regular basis. So if you see the 90-30 there? So if I'm Justin and I'm in Tier 2, that means, let's say for example, I'm having difficulty in reading. All the kids, let's just say for an example, get 90 minutes of reading a day in their classroom. Well, since I'm struggling, or since Justin's struggling with reading, he's going to get an additional 30 minutes, all right? And there's going to be some special interventions, reading interventions that are going to be used to help meet his needs. Now, we're going to identify what those needs are, and then we're kind of like laser-like, or get that magnifying glass, we're going to kind of zero in on him in a small group, might even be one-on-one, to help him become successful, to help catch him up. Might even be some acceleration strategies involved there. All right? So it's beyond Tier 1. We know the student has special needs. He might be in with a reading specialist. He might be in with another teacher, but he's going to get some more intense interventions in a setting that better meets his needs. All right? And then if we look at the rationale, students with learning needs will benefit from small group instruction. Now let's say that after a couple months, we've looked, let me back up. At Tier 2 also, we're going to be progress monitoring Justin on a regular basis. In other words, we're going to be assessing him on his specific skills in reading perhaps every week. And we'll be plotting that data on a chart, and we'll be looking at the data on a regular basis to see if he's making progress. If he's not making progress, so we're going to throw an intervention in there to see if we can kind of change or alter that. If he is making progress, then good. We're going to continue using the intervention. So PM, or progress monitoring, or dipsticking, whatever you want to call it, is a really important part of Tier 2, and it's done much more frequently than it is in Tier 1. So let's say Justin's continuing to have problems. So now we're going to move to Tier 3. All right? He's still going to get his classroom instruction, let's say 90 minutes, but we're going to throw in an extra hour of additional instruction every day. We might have to kind of do away with social studies or science, but we're going to figure out a way to get him the additional help that he needs. And the groups will either be smaller, or a good chance at Tier 3 they're going to be one-on-one. And then progress monitoring could be weekly, or it could be daily. So a lot of intense intervention there at Tier 3. And students who continue to have learning difficulties need more intense instruction. So if you take a look at these tiers, you see how they build in terms of the type of interventions, the length of time the interventions are used, the length of time in terms of extra support is provided, and the frequency of progress monitoring.